Mr. Secretary-General, thank you very much for your time today. My first question, you just came back from Pakistan where you visited areas hit by climate change-related disaster. We're now alarmed at the drought and possible famine that threatens Somalia. What do you want to say to those who still deny that climate change is real? Do we not ignore it at our peril?
Climate change is the defining issue of our time. And I'm extremely worried because with the war in Ukraine and with several other events, climate change seems to have moved out of the priorities for many decision makers around the world. And this is a suicide. We see emissions growing and we see fossil fuels become fashionable again. When we know that fossil fuels are the main responsible for the progressive war against nature that we have been waging in our history. It is absolutely essential to reduce emissions from now on. And unfortunately, when we should be able to reduce 45% of the emissions up to 2030, we are with the perspective of increased emissions of 14% in 2030. So we absolutely need to reverse this trend. We are moving into a catastrophic situation and we have not much time to turn things around. And at the same time, when one looks at Pakistan, the level of destruction, an area flooded that's 3 times the area of my country, we need to increase the support to developing countries, not only in the reduction of emissions, but in building resilience, in building the sustainable infrastructure that is necessary for those countries to be able to resist to the impacts that are already devastating over them when most of the hotspots in the world come from countries that do not contribute in a meaningful way to climate change.
Every year we usher in a new session of the General Assembly, often seen as a highlight of the year for the United Nations. What is your focus for this year's GA, the first since the pandemic that we are meeting in person, and with a major war in Europe taking away attention from other priorities for the world?
Well, my main objective is to make it clear that the geopolitical divisions that we are witnessing today are terrible when the world is facing climate change, when the world is facing the perspective of other pandemics and the COVID has not yet been solved, when the world is facing high levels of inequality between developed countries and developing countries and huge inequality inside countries, when the world needs to really turn around in all these aspects, we need unity, we need cooperation, we need dialogue, and the present geopolitical divides are not allowing it to happen. We need to change course.
The war in Ukraine has triggered one of the fastest and biggest refugee crises in human history. Kyiv was bombed as you were visiting the country. How does this crisis differ from many others that you've seen as a High Commissioner and later as Secretary-General?
Most of the crises I have witnessed are crises in developing countries, relatively poor countries, and most of them are internal, even if afterwards there is an intervention of external powers, but they became as civil wars or terrorist activities inside the country. Now we have a war between one superpower and Ukraine, that is also a modern country, and we are talking of levels of devastation that are not possible in situations where the nature of the armaments and the military capacity in place are completely different. So this is indeed, once again, a war between two states created by the invasion of one state by another, with levels of armament and levels of mobilization of forces that is unparalleled in recent times. On the other hand, we are witnessing the fastest movement of refugees and displaced persons in recent history with terrible humanitarian consequences.
You're hosting a major gathering to look at transforming education, which has suffered in so many countries. You are keen to find responses to the economic slowdown that has seen a massive decline in progress in sustainable development. In the midst of major geopolitical tensions, what is your best case scenario to make progress on these fronts?
Well, if I had to choose one thing to improve the world situation in peace and security, that thing would be education. If I had to choose one thing to improve the capacity of understanding of climate change and the response to climate change, that thing is education. When I look to anything that could reduce inequalities in the world, that thing would be education. But unfortunately, we are seeing with the dramatic situation that we have in the world today, climate, war, pandemics, we are seeing budgets, education budgets being reduced. And so the Summit on Education is a moment to mobilize the whole international community, to make countries understand that they need to invest much more in education, and to make developed countries understand that they need to amplify, together with international financial institutions, the support to developing countries for them to be able to invest in education. We have launched the International Finance Facility for Education with Gordon Brown, and my hope is that this facility will be quickly funded by all donors in order to make really a difference in the most vulnerable populations in the world.
Thank you. Your Black Sea grain initiative has already seen almost 3 million tons of food from Ukraine leave for destinations across the world, helping alleviate the food crisis and saving lives. What are some of the essential components of this success story? How optimistic are you that this formula could be applied to other complicated situations?
I think that this has demonstrated that discreet diplomacy still is able to achieve what megaphone diplomacy does not. This agreement would not have been possible if we had not worked persistently to get it done with high discretion, avoiding the creation of situations in which inevitably both parties start to fight each other. And this is, I would say, the recipe for many other crises in the world. Let's do everything possible to reestablish the importance of discreet diplomacy in crisis solution in today's world.
Human rights have always been one of the pillars of the UN's work. You have flagged the dangers posed by rising hate speech, xenophobia, and populist nationalism. Why is this happening? And what, on the other hand, gives you hope?
Well, these things have always existed in the world, but they are now immensely amplified by social media and by all the IT platforms that exist around the world. On the other hand, when countries have difficulties in solving their problems, nationalism, xenophobia, making scapegoats the foreigners is unfortunately something that is becoming more and more frequent. We need to understand that human rights must unite communities, unite countries, that racism and xenophobia are two absolutely unacceptable manifestations of hatred that we need to be able to eliminate in our world.
For a long time, you have been expressing concerns over the reality that the world is moving in the direction of polarization, or what you've called the great fracture. As Secretary-General, it is obvious that this political reality makes your job more difficult. What can you do to bring the world together?
I have not the power to make miracles. What we can do is to be determined, to use as much as possible the instruments at our disposal, the good offices, the mediation, and to do everything possible to make the world understand that the enormous challenges that we face can only be addressed with solidarity and with cooperation and unity.
This time last year, it was COVID-19 that seemed to be the biggest global crisis we were all living through, impacting the General Assembly and the UN operations. What should governments and the UN be doing to keep public health high up on the agenda?
First of all, it is very important to solve the problems of vaccination where those problems still exist, and this is something that is mobilizing the UN system entirely. And second, it is absolutely essential to provide the countries that were impacted by the COVID, by the lockdowns, by the end of tourism, by many other aspects, and that are today in a desperate situation, in a perfect storm, without fiscal space, with an increased debt. It's necessary to have mechanisms of debt relief, to have mechanisms of provision of liquidity to the developing countries that are more in stress, including middle-income countries, in order for them to be able to recover. When we saw that the richer countries were able to print billions or even trillions to relaunch their economies. Unfortunately, developing countries cannot do the same. If not, their currencies would, of course, go down the drain. And so international solidarity must be reestablished.
As you have started your second term, how do you feel you would like to make the UN fit for purpose? What is the biggest reform you would like to see happen if you had it your way?
Now we have launched our common agenda. Our common agenda is a series of projects, of ideas, of proposals, whose objective is to make the UN much more effective and at the same time to reestablish multilateralism as the way to solve the world problems. My main objective is to make our common agenda be developed and adopted by member states and transform itself into the main instrument we have supporting the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals in order to be able to bring more peace, more development, more justice and effective respect of human rights to the world.
Given your emphasis on gender parity and engaging youth, what will you do to ensure your legacy in this respect? Do you want to see a young female successor?
Well, first of all, we have reached parity already in relation to senior management of the UN, about 200 senior leaders. We have parity in resident coordinators, which means the coordinators of the UN action in the different countries of the world. And we are moving with the objective of reaching parity in 2028 at all levels of the United Nations work. On the other hand, we have been mainstreaming gender into all policies of the UN and to the action of all agencies and in all the work that we do. About the Secretary-General, I'm sorry, I'm not a woman, but I would, of course, see with a lot of interest and sympathy the possibility to have women, not only as Secretary-General of the United Nations, but as leaders of the most important countries in the world.